So first of all, welcome everybody to this program this evening, Finding God in the Pandemic. And this is an interfaith program, one of many that we've been organizing here in Houston. We have a group of pastors, rabbis, and Muslims that have been meeting about once a month to discuss various issues. And then we try to present programs like this a few times a year to our communities to engage in an interfaith dialogue on topics of mutual concern. And of course, one of the big topics of mutual concern right now is the pandemic. And so we thought we'd talk about what our faith traditions have to teach us about that. So tonight we're going to have myself, Steven Morgen at Congregation Beth Yeshurun. We're going to have Paul Ramsey, who is at Sojourn Church. And then we're going to have Imam Imad Enchassi, who is actually in Oklahoma City, and he'll tell a little bit about himself and then talk about the Islamic perspective from his point of view. Let me add at the beginning that each of us, although we represent our faith traditions, certainly by no means represent everybody in our faith traditions. So I'm going to present my particular understanding of the Jewish tradition, but there are many other ways of understanding the Jewish tradition as well. I'll try and mention a few of them this evening, but and I'm sure the same will be true for Pastor Paul and Imam Imad. So without further ado, let's get down to the business. Where do we find God in this pandemic? There are some people, I imagine, some who are very traditional belief kind of people who believe that God is involved in every detail and everything that happens in the world, that nothing happens in the world unless God himself commands it. That's a pretty traditional belief. And since we believe that God is good, that leads to the question, why would God want such a pandemic to strike? Is there some kind of punishment for something that human beings did? So my particular view is not one of those traditional views. My view is that God created a beautiful, magnificent universe, and particularly this planet Earth, that has lots and lots of intricate details, complex life forms that all interact beautifully and magnificently together, and have created this fascinating planet with mountains and hills and rain and snow and different life forms that make us excited to be alive. But among the things that God created, for reasons we may not fully understand, were disease, earthquakes, and floods, for instance. As human beings, God endowed us with wisdom and with curiosity and with brains to try and understand the causes of and the workings of nature, and to try and explain why these things are in fact necessary for life to exist in all its beauty on this planet. But we may not have fully figured that out yet. One of the things, though, that Judaism does say is although it's important for us to love God, to believe that there is a God, a creator, and to have faith in God, the Judaism emphasizes much more what we do in this world rather than what we believe. And so what I'm going to show is that the more interesting question from the Jewish tradition is not why God caused this to happen, but what does God want us to do about it? And so I have a text which I'm going to share now. So I'm going to put that up over here. Okay. So from the beginning, God created human beings. Everybody can see the text now? Yes? Okay, so God created human beings, as we say in chapter 1 of Genesis. We believe that God created us in his image. We don't, in the Jewish world, understand that literally. In other words, God doesn't look like this, but rather that there's some aspect of humanity that is that captures something about God's essence. And we believe that that is our brains, our intelligence, our wisdom, our compassion, those things that make us uniquely human as opposed to the other creatures on the planet. And so God has created us, endowed us with these aspects of his self. And he then commanded us, he blessed Adam and Eve, and God said to them, be fertile and increase and fill the earth and master it. Rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the things that creep on earth. So the first thing is that we're supposed to be the masters of the planet. And indeed, human beings have become masters of the planet. We really control most of what happens on this planet right now. In chapter 2, God was a little more explicit. God took Adam and Eve and he placed them in the garden, and he said to till it and tend it. And here we're not supposed to just rule over it and trash the planet. We're supposed to be the caretakers, the gardeners that make sure everything grows, that it grows well, that everything works nicely together. God put us in charge to take care of the planet. That was the mission that he gave us. Nevertheless, as it says in Psalm 24 and many other places in the Bible, everything belongs to God. The earth is the Lord's and all that it holds, the world and all its inhabitants. Everything belongs to God. We are just tenants. We are living in God's apartment complex, as it were. And because we're only tenants, we're not allowed to trash the building, right? It's God's building. So God's allowed us to make fixes to the building. We can fix the plumbing. We can fix the roof. We can make the apartment work better, but we're not allowed to trash it. That's kind of sort of I'm distilling now lots of different sources I could have brought in the Bible to show that the purpose of God creating humanity was to take care of the planet. In Deuteronomy, in the book of Deuteronomy, it has this statement, which is fairly famous in the Jewish world. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day that I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, if you and your offspring will live. And how do you choose life? By, first of all, loving God, and secondly, heeding his commandments. Now, in the Jewish tradition, we believe that the 5 books of Moses, those first 5 books in the Bible, have 613 commandments. But of those 613 commandments, only about 270 of them are actually still effective today. A lot of them dealt with sacrifices and other things that don't apply today. Only about 270 of those commandments apply today. And of those commandments, most of them have to do with how we treat each other. That we should love your neighbor as yourself, that we should be honest in our business dealings, we should use honest weights and measures, we should set up a judicial system with honest courts, and we should take care of the widows, orphans, the poor people, the people who need help, those who are disabled. We should be trying to look after them to help them, and we should also be kind to animals. That's actually one of the commandments as well. In fact, several commandments talk about being kind to animals. So most of the commandments are about how we are supposed to take care of God's earth and God's creatures and each other. There are commandments, of course, in the Torah that are specific to Jews about life cycle events, holidays, keeping kosher, the laws of kashrut, the dietary laws. There are things about how to set up a Jewish society particularly, but many of these commandments are simply about being good, about being honest and fair, and about being kind and compassionate. So I'm going to skip this Mishnah source over here for now. It's not that important. And then focus on, so what does this mean for us in this time of pandemic? Some people have called a global timeout. Right? Nature or God has put us in a timeout, sent us to our corners to contemplate our role in God's plan. So what do we do during this global timeout? The first thing I would say is don't despair. This may be new to us living in the 21st century, and not since 1918 or so, 1919, the last time we had a pandemic flu, have we had to experience something quite like this. So it's relatively new to us in this generation. But human beings have confronted terrible plagues, malaria, typhus, polio, tuberculosis, and many other diseases in the past. And for the most part, we have overcome them all. And we can, and we will eventually overcome this one too. So don't despair. Don't give up. That's the first thing. Second thing, we need to take practical safety measures. Wear a mask in public, practice social distancing, and wash your hands. These are the three things that all of the doctors, all the epidemiologists are telling us to do in order to prevent the spread of this virus. If you don't have to go out, stay home. If you do have to go out for work or whatever, put on a mask. Don't get close to somebody else. Wash your hands frequently, and you can prevent this virus from spreading to other people. The Talmud tells an interesting story about a boy who obeys his father. His father tells him to get eggs for breakfast, and he climbs up a tree, and he shoos the mother bird away from the nest before he takes the eggs, because that's required in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 6 and 7. Shoo the mother bird away. She shouldn't see you stealing her children in front of her face. She'll come back to an empty nest. It'll still be traumatic, but it's not as traumatic as watching her babies taken away in front of her face. Shoo the mother bird away before you take the eggs. So the boy does that. He is thereby fulfilling two commandments. He's honoring his father, like it says, honor your father and your mother, and he's shooing the mother bird away from the nest before he takes the eggs. And both of those commandments in the 5 books of Moses, it says right there, if you follow these commandments, you will have a long life. And what happens according to the story in the Talmud? He falls out of the tree, he breaks his neck, and he dies. And the Talmud asks, how can this be? Did God lie? God promised a long life. And here he's fulfilling these two commandments, which promise a long life, and yet he died immediately. Why did that happen? And after a long discussion, which is not important for this evening, the Talmud concludes he climbed a rickety ladder. And the moral of the story is you cannot take unnecessary risks with your life, expecting God to protect you, even if you're doing kind things for people. So you need to take the necessary precautions. Wear a mask in public, practice social distancing, wash your hands. That's number 2. Number 3, provide support, emotional, financial, or otherwise, to those who are fighting this disease. I've talked to many doctors and nurses now who are in the hospitals every day watching people die, and die a lonely death where their family and friends can't be there. And it's really gut-wrenching for these folks because they have to go to work every day and they come home exhausted and they come home depleted. And we need to give them support in any way that we can. And while we're at it, we should also support everybody else who works in the hospital because they are all part of that system. Even the people who clean the bedpans. These people are doing necessary work and we should be trying to help them and give them support. And if you stay home and you're getting, like sometimes we do, and we have groceries delivered, so you should be nice to the people who are doing the delivery and nice to everybody who is out there doing the things that are necessary for our society to function. The fourth thing is we need to help those who are suffering the most. This pandemic has exposed and amplified the disparities that exist in our society. Those whose jobs were not secure, people who didn't earn enough money to live day to day, let alone save a nest egg for a rainy day. There's people who didn't have enough money to save and they live day to day and now they're out of a job. People whose health insurance was tied to their employment and now they're unemployed and they've lost their insurance. People who may be evicted soon because Congress hasn't passed support for them. Hate to say it, there's not blaming any particular political party, but Congress is not helping right now. People who may be evicted and out on the street. Can you imagine being out on the street in this pandemic? So we are, as religious people, and I'm sure my colleagues would agree with me, this is something that religious people are supposed to do, is to help those who are suffering and those in need in whatever ways that we can. And finally, we can work to improve ourselves. So we're spending more time at home now. Many of us, we have maybe a little more free time. I haven't noticed so much free time for myself, but if you find yourself with more free time, work on personal character traits, kindness, compassion, patience, gratitude, humility. These are all really important right now, but they will also be important when we come out of our homes. Honor, generosity, truth, moderation, responsibility, and faith. If we improve our own personal characteristics, when we do get out and into public again, we will be able to create a stronger and more just, fair, compassionate society. And our character will be developed to be, to help to be pillars of a new society that will be even better than it was before. So I just would conclude by saying that God has put us, since Genesis, since Adam and Eve, he has put us in charge of the planet. He has put us in the driver's seat, so to speak. And yet so many of us pretend like we're just passengers along for the ride. And meanwhile, the car is careening down the freeway out of control. We need to get ourselves back in the driver's seat, grab the steering wheel, and drive the car safely towards the destination. And so that's what I would say would be a Jewish response to where is God in this pandemic. If we do the things that God wants us to do, God will be found in the kindness and the acts of kindness and justice and fairness that we perform for other people in the world. And now I'm going to turn this over to Paul, our Christian expert here, who's going to give us a Christian view of this subject. I have to stop the share. Okay, there you go.
Thank you, Rabbi Morgen. That is wonderful. And as you know, as a Christian pastor speaking alongside a rabbi and an imam, we are all in the Abrahamic faith tradition, and so there will be a lot of similarities. You used the same Bible that I use, Rabbi Morgen, when you were reading those passages, and so there is a good bit of similarity, especially those pieces at the end. That's very, I agree as a Christian pastor. That's my hope for our folks as well. But so just to introduce myself briefly, my name is Paul Ramsey. I'm a pastor, one of the pastors at a church called Sojourn Heights, which is one congregation from the family of Sojourn churches that's here in Houston. And I have the honor, of course, of presenting the Christian perspective on where God is in this pandemic. And so, and I have to admit, like Rabbi Morgen did, there's many Christian perspectives on this pandemic, just as there are among your traditions, Jewish and Muslim traditions, and in your communities. And so, but as I present from a Christian perspective, I'm going to do my best to capture something that I believe that all Christians can agree upon about God and his role in the pandemic. To share a little bit about me as kind of a self-disclosure. I am at a non-denominational church. We're non-denominational, we're Reformed theology. Would be our affiliation. And I've learned in my conversations with a few rabbis and imams that Reformed in the way that we use it is very different from how the Jewish community uses the word Reformed. A Reformed, especially a non-affiliated Reformed Jewish congregation, would be along the theologically liberal side. Whereas when a Christian says I ascribe to Reformed theology, that's we are in the conservative part of the evangelical movement. Using the word theologically as opposed to politically within Christianity. So I just wanted to give that as a self-disclosure in case you're wondering the perspective that I'm coming from, but I will do my best to give a general Christian perspective on the pandemic. So to turn to that question, where is God in this pandemic? What is he doing? Why is it happening? What are the resources that my faith as a Christian pastor gives me and Christian people in this pandemic? I guess for the sake of our Muslim and Jewish friends in here, I want to do a little bit of work to get to the answer for that question. The specific question regarding the pandemic, how God's word applies to this specific situation, begs at kind of a deeper question, which is the question of suffering, like Rabbi Morgen kind of pointed to. Why does God allow suffering? What is the Christian perspective on why bad things happen? What the Bible says on suffering in the midst of this pandemic that's already caused widespread suffering, that's indiscriminate, many deaths. That's a question that we're inevitably brought to. And there's a lot that I would love to say about the problem of suffering. This is not a problem of suffering summary. However, I want to provide a brief summary so that we can, because that's the bedrock on which I give the Christian perspective to the coronavirus pandemic. In short, the Christian faith, the worldview that the Bible informs, has a meaningful place for suffering. The Bible neither celebrates suffering, nor does it dismiss suffering. Suffering is a very meaningful part of God's people, the life of God's people. There's a lot of passages that come to my mind from the Bible, but for now, let's just consider a couple of Psalms, and I'm going to share my screen. Actually, you know what? I meant to do this just a moment ago. I'm going to put in the chat a link to a PDF that you are welcome to download. And you can look along because I'll click to it and then away from it. But can you guys see what I'm sharing right now? This, where's God in the pandemic? Okay, wonderful. So there's a lot of passages that come to mind when we talk about suffering. And my mind, of course, goes to the Psalms. A lot of you are familiar with the Psalms, especially our Jewish friends. You might be thinking, hey, that's our book. But the Psalter, of course, a book of songs, a book of poems. The Bible, it's essentially the prayer book of the Bible, is how Christians see the Psalms. Some of the Psalms are celebratory, some are penitential. They're Psalms of confession, where you bring yourself in penitence before the Lord. But many of these Psalms address suffering, and they address it head on. So just for a couple of examples, you see this here, Psalm 22, verses 1-5. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? And then this emphasis, oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. This is a person who's really suffering. This is not someone who just says, who ignores their suffering. They're coming to God honestly and saying, I'm suffering. Where are you, God? Skipping ahead to Psalm 69. Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire where there is no foothold. I've come into deep waters and the flood sweeps over me. And then here's the personal part where this psalmist is crying out to God. I am weary with my crying out. My throat is parched. My eyes grow dim with waiting for my God. So there's these Psalms that focus on suffering, but I wanted to share one more. Psalm 23 is one of my favorites, and it's a favorite. It's the Lord is my shepherd. That's the Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. This is a Psalm written by King David. And you might be familiar with where David was when he wrote this Psalm. He was in the wilderness, most likely, in the wilderness, fleeing King Saul for his life. And so he's in the midst, he's fleeing his life. This very powerful king is chasing after him to kill him. And he writes this beautiful Psalm. And I emphasize the parts there. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we love quoting that verse. But he said, I will fear no evil. But he's in the middle of this valley of shadow of death. He's in the presence of his enemies. But in the presence of his enemies, the Lord prepares a table before him. He anoints his head with oil. His cup overflows. And he's convinced that God's goodness and mercy shall follow him all the days of his life. And he shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And so what the Psalms tell us about suffering is a few things. Suffering is a universal experience of God's people throughout history, both in the days of ancient Israel and for Christians in the life of the church after the time of Jesus and the salvation he came to offer. We still suffer. Jesus himself, the Psalms were the book in the Old Testament, as we call it, the Torah, the Tanakh, that is most often quoted by Jesus. And we also see that in these Psalms, that when God's people suffer, he is particularly near to them. He waits for his people to cry out to him, and then he answers. The great salvation story in the Old Testament from the Pentateuch, the Torah, Exodus, God's people are in the wilderness in slavery in Egypt. And what is it that occasions God's action? They cried out, and it says God heard them. It's one of my favorite verses in Exodus. God heard them, and at that point, the salvation, the great Exodus was kicked off. And then Psalms tell us that suffering causes us to turn to God with hope for his promised renewal and deliverance from that suffering. God promises good to his people. Suffering is a reminder that things are not as they should be. We need God to intervene. Time and again, we see God draw near to his people, like the Exodus, and then eventually deliver them. And the Bible tells us also where all of this suffering comes from. So if God promises good to his people, why suffering in the first place? Rabbi Morgen, you address this beautifully, so I don't have to say very much here. Suffering comes from the fall. in the Garden of Eden, according to Christians. When God created all things, he placed humanity in the splendid garden. When mankind fell on account of their sin, they were cast into the desert wilderness that was marked by hunger, thirst, exhaustion, pain. In other words, suffering. There were no pandemics before the fall. In other words, the fall into sin, the rebellion against God, is why bad things happen in the first place. We talked a great deal about that as our program, actually, back at the program back in February. Actually, the dialogue that we had together as a multi-faith group. The ongoing bad things that happen in the world are reverberations of the consequences of the fall. They are ultimately a result of human sin. But this is a very important clarification. The Bible holds us back as Christians in some very important ways when we try to talk about why suffering is happening in any particular circumstance. So generally, suffering is on account of sin, but when we try to give particular situations, why this pandemic, why this person's cancer, the Bible kind of holds us back from assigning particular blame. See, one of the consistent assumptions that we make, kind of across the board, across cultures, is that if you're suffering, it's your fault. You must have done something to incur this suffering. The Bible, of course, does have room for that kind of suffering. It's referred to suffering as an evildoer, right? On account of your own sin, that is, of course, to be avoided. So if you get put in jail for a crime that you've committed, that is suffering, but that's suffering that is your fault, right? Sometimes, though, we try to look at mistakes we've made or sins we've committed, and we try to tie those into an unrelated struggle that we're facing, saying, man, this must be judgment for that. For example, this cancer must be judgment for the time that I did X, Y, or Z. My husband cheated on me. That's because I didn't, or that's because I did X, Y, or Z. I didn't get this promotion at work. I'm losing my sight in my 30s. Oh, that's because I haven't been as faithful to God as I was supposed to be. But from a Christian perspective, we are not supposed to do that. Let me bring up two stories from the Bible in that regard. And so I'll come back down here. Can you guys still see this screen? Wonderful. Let's look at the story of Job. So Job, you might be familiar with the story of Job, Jewish friends, of course. You remember Job's friends? They sat with Job, and his family has died. Job had been tested by the accuser in the divine council. Christians call him Satan. Job was sick. He had lost everything. He was covered with sores, and his friends just sat quietly with him. They were great friends until they opened their mouths. And do you remember what they said when they opened their mouths? Job's friends said, "You must be missing something, Job. You must have some unconfessed sin. God is punishing you for something." And you remember Job's response? Job says, "No, I mean, test me. I'm an open book. I didn't do anything to deserve this suffering." But Job's friends keep going, and they go on for chapter after chapter after chapter, and they keep pestering him. Chapter 4, his friend Eliphaz says, "Remember, who that was innocent, Job, ever perished? Or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same." Eliphaz goes on to say, "Despise not the discipline of the Almighty," right? You see what Eliphaz is doing. He says, we know God disciplines sinners, so because you're suffering, that must be discipline for something that you did. His friend Bildad, chapter 8, "Behold, God will not reject a blameless man, nor take the hand of evildoers." You see what Bildad concludes? Bildad says suffering is rejection. If you suffer, that means that God has rejected you because you're not blameless. God has abandoned you to fend for yourself. So that's one story from the Bible that I wanted to point to. But then an answer to that, the other story is actually in the New Testament that I want to point to, John chapter 9. You might not know that Job's friends show up in the New Testament. This time, they're Jesus's disciples. And there's this fascinating story told in the book of John chapter 9 here. I'm not, of course, going to read the whole story, but Jesus is with his disciples, and they pass by this man who was blind from birth. And Jesus's disciples ask him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And this is what Jesus' disciples say. Jesus answers to that question. He says, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. I can't recommend enough that you go read the story of chapter 9. It's really fascinating before and after that to give a little bit of context. But here's what Jesus is saying to his disciples. He's saying this man's life has been hard on account of his blindness, but this is not punishment for sin. He tells them, it's not because of his sin, it's not because of his parents' sin. You're missing the point. It's because God's works are supposed to be displayed in him. And then Jesus goes on to heal him. You see at the end here. So he gives these instructions. The man goes and washed, and he came back seeing. So he was miraculously given back his sight. What Jesus is getting at there, and I think the fact that the book of Job, if you're familiar with it, it ends without this clear answer for the why question. We're never told why Job suffered, or why God allowed it to happen. We know a few things, but we're never told why God allowed it to happen. But what Jesus is getting at is the fact that suffering is sometimes judgment for sin. While that makes it complicated, we must know that there are other kinds of suffering, and we should not always look for blame, especially in seemingly unrelated, senseless suffering, such as with the coronavirus pandemic. There's suffering as an evildoer. There's suffering as a result of your faithfulness to God. We're told as Christians, there's suffering at the hands of someone who is evil. A personal trauma, but then there's also this kind of suffering that just happens to you. A sickness, a pandemic, the loss of a loved one, and you don't know why. That kind of suffering, Jesus says, to that kind of suffering, there is a purpose, you just haven't seen it yet. We're not left with nothing after that. Of course, we're told that suffering refines us, it tests us, it makes us better. Not only, though, does suffering refine us, make us stronger, not only does God draw near to us, but it also points to the fact that God is coming back one day to make all things new. I cannot fix, this is the Christian perspective on anyone's suffering, including this pandemic. I can't fix your suffering, but God can, and he will, in a way that's far more glorious and far better than any of us can possibly imagine. And so what is this? So kind of in summary, as I wrap up, what does this have to do with the coronavirus? I can't tell you as a Christian pastor why the COVID pandemic is happening. There's some things that I can point at that are good things from a Christian perspective. There's people's idols in our language have been stripped from them, and they're growing more mature. People are calling out to God now like they haven't before. There have been some really neat opportunities for connection, especially through through Zoom and other things. There's some good things that have happened, but there's also some really terrible things that have happened. There's 5 million cases, 160,000 deaths in the United States. There's 20 million cases, over 700,000 deaths across the world due to this pandemic. I don't know why these things have happened, but I can tell you that God is working, and at some point he is going to make all things new. He is going to bring restoration, and he asks us to trust him, even though we can't see with our eyes. There's a proverb, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. And how can we trust him? I guess the key to the Christian perspective is because at the heart of Christianity is suffering. Jesus on the cross proclaimed victory over all things through his suffering. The world wants victory over suffering. We can even see it in our leaders talking about this pandemic. We're going to go to war and we're going to defeat this pandemic. We want victory over suffering. But Jesus demonstrates for us that victory comes through suffering. You can't get it any other way. So for the Christian, we're not to be surprised by the coronavirus pandemic and the suffering that comes with it, but we're to rejoice with hope in that our suffering unites us with Jesus and with one another. We're to rejoice with hope in that suffering unites us one with another. We are to mourn with those who mourn, draw near to those who are suffering, and appeal to God on their behalf. And we are eagerly to look forward to the day when God will ultimately heal his land. And I guess at that point, that's where I'll conclude the Christian perspective. Where is God in this pandemic? He's with us. He invites us to trust in him as Christians. And he invites us, I guess, simply this, the practical steps that Rabbi Morgen gave are excellent. I agreed with all of them. And as Christians, the next step that you take, Jesus said, if you were to sum all the 600, I forget the number, Rabbi, forgive me,
13.
laws, 613, if I were to distill that, Jesus was asked, what's the most important commandment? Jesus said, love the Lord your God. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And so you draw near to your neighbor, get to know them, listen to their story, meet their needs, draw near to them in an appropriate, respectful, cautious fashion, but get to know them and serve them, just following the model of Jesus, who came to serve as our suffering servant. So
Okay.
That's the Christian view. And now I'll pass it over to Dr. Imam Imad Enchassi.
Thank you so much. I totally agree with both perspectives, and if I could share my screen. Hello, my name is Imad Enchassi, and I'm the Imam of the Islamic Society of Greater Oklahoma City. I have about 7 slides that I want to share with you today. In a sense, can you see that now? That's good. In a sense, finding God in a pandemic is a very broad subject, but I always feel obliged that before I speak, to identify myself. In a sense, often Islam is very misunderstood, and it's a religion that is cloaked with a lot of uncertainty and a lot of misunderstanding. So let me identify myself in that couple of minutes. Identify myself from Genesis chapter 21. I want you to look at the slide here as we basically look at where Abraham and Sarah had lived in Jerusalem. Abraham could not get any children, and Sarah asked him to take this other woman by the name of Hagar. Hagar began for Abraham, of course, Ishmael, and from the biblical perspective, Sarah have banished Hagar. So Abraham would take his wife all the way from Jerusalem, stopped in this truck stop here in a city called Tima or Medina, and then eventually end up in this place, we call it Paran. And here where Abraham, Hagar, and Ishmael, actually Abraham left his wife Hagar in the wilderness of Paran, which is today's Mecca, and took off and went back to his wife Sarah. Hagar, as you look from the scripture here, called 911 and Child Protective Services, and she said, "Oh God, do not let this baby cry or this baby vanish." And God promised her He will make him into a great nation. And she opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. Muslims to this day still drink from the well of water. And of course, Prophet Muhammad came from Ishmael. So I'm glad to announce to you that I am your brother from a different mother. The very last brother, and I'm glad to go last among all those wonderful speakers. In a sense, it's awesome to go fast because you're gonna see a lot of similarities, because the Quran, for instance, when we look at the Quran, which is Muslims believe it's the final revelation, 40% of the Quran is stories of the prophets. And this slide says that the P in the prophet stands for pandemic. And you would see the very definition of a pandemic is a Greek word that some kind of a mishap that affects a vast majority of people. So in the Quran, you'd see the story of Adam and Eve and paradise loss, Noah and the flood, Jonah. That's misspelled in the belly of the fish, Job and the disease, Abraham and the idea of sacrificing his son, Moses standing for Pharaoh, the story of Jesus and Mary, and of course the story of Joseph as well. In each of these stories, you would see the word that my friend used is suffering, but you would see actually a society that is unsatisfactory. As one of my Jewish friends said, life is unsatisfactory, suffering is optional. Those stories and many more that are mentioned in the Quran, 40% of the Quran makes up stories of the prophets, and the stories of the prophets come to us with three three things to remember. Especially, number one is to trust God when things don't make sense. Here's a verse from chapter 2, verse 216. But you may hate thing, although it is good for you, and you may love a thing, although it is evil for you. And this is trust in God, for he knows and you don't know. The very stories that we read, all the stories of the prophets have these 3 points in common. Number one is to actually trust in God Almighty when things don't make sense, whether it's Noah's building his ark in the middle of the wilderness, or Abraham actually slaughtering his son, and God sent him a ram. Moses standing against Pharaoh and God saving Moses and Aaron from Pharaoh, and all the stories that we look at. The underlining message here to trust in God when things do not make sense. The pandemic that is taking place right now, we're trying to make a sense of it, and for us, for people of faith, we understand to trust God even when things do not make sense. The second one is never ever give up hope. All these 40% of the stories, or the 40% of the Quran that talks about prophet stories, conclude that we should never ever give up hope. We should not be a people that despair. Here's a verse from the Quran that talks about the story of Joseph. This is actually a statement made by Jacob. When Joseph was taken away, and also when Benjamin was taken away, Jacob looked at his sons and said, "Oh, my sons, go and find out about Joseph and his brother Benjamin, and despair not of the relief from God. Indeed, no one despairs of the relief from God except those disbelieving folks, or this disbelieving people." Now, I want you to look at this verse in a sense. That was actually my sermon a couple weeks ago. When we give up hope, we actually saying God is not capable and incapable of delivering us. We're actually saying that God cannot deliver us. We're actually saying that God cannot find a vaccine, or God cannot find a cure for coronavirus, or God, what is this thing that's happening around us? That is really when there's that feeling of despair, or feeling of losing hope, we are losing God, or we're losing our faith in God. Of course, the story of Joseph is beautiful because Joseph forgave his brothers, and he returned to his parents. The consistency in the message, number 3, in all the stories of the prophets, is there's a God's divine wisdom that human beings sometimes, or reasoning of our reasoning sometimes, might not fully grasp the idea. Why people are suffering? Why is this happening? We don't have the entire picture. We do not see things from the divine perspective. We see little bits and pieces. Yes, despite all this superhighway of information and the internet and social media, we don't know the reason behind many things. Chapter 18, which Muslims read every single Friday, talks about Moses, and Moses take a trip with this, what the Quran called the green giant. This have nothing to do with green beans or peas, but the green giant symbolically represent fate. And Moses take 3 stories actually, and each of these stories, Moses was told not to question anything, but just to watch and learn. So Moses goes around with this man, and this man, and Moses go into the ship, and Moses makes a hole, and this man makes a hole in the ship. And Moses looks at him and said, "You made a hole in the ship? This is really something that is very evil." The story goes on that this man takes a child away, a child dies in the story, and then this man actually builds a wall for people who have refused to help them. So the answer of all these stories from the green giant or fate tells Moses that, look, I made a hole in the ship because there was a tyrant and there was a pirate that's going around and taking all these beautiful good ships. So God wanted to make a hole in the ship so these ships will stay with those poor people that are working on it. And as for the child is going to grow up and give his family trouble. So God wanted to replace him with a better, pious child. And as for the wall that is falling, and we fixed it, although the people that own the wall did not help us, is because there's a treasure hidden under the wall. And God wanted those children, and it belongs to orphan children. And God wanted those children to grow up and extract that treasure from under there. Then Moses went bluntly, actually, with that story. Moses went bluntly, and he wanted to see God's divine wisdom in a very powerful way. So God asked Moses to go to a tree, and Moses goes to a tree, and Moses goes by, and he said, just watch. And Moses sits in the tree, and he watches. So here comes a rich and a powerful horseman, stops by the river, let his horse drink from the water. He drinks from the water, and the horseman sits under that tree, untie his belt, and sleeps under the tree for a little while, and he loses his money. He leaves his bag of money right next to the tree. The horseman wakes up, jumps on his horse, and takes off. Here comes a second person. It comes a poor single mom with her teenage son. They drink from the same water, and Moses is watching. They drink from the same water, and they come under the tree, and the teenage son finds the money. Goes to his mom and say, look, I found some money. They looked around, they looked up, they looked down, they don't find no one. They take the money, and they take off. Meanwhile, an older raggedy man would come and do exactly the same thing, drink from the water, rest under the tree. And Moses is watching all these stories with his human reasoning. Moses sees this rich and powerful horseman coming back for his money. He finds no one except the old raggedy man. They both argue. The rich and powerful horseman actually takes his sword and takes the old raggedy man out, and gets on his horse and leave. And Moses, of course, is speechless because he's not looking at God's divine wisdom. He's looking from a human reasoning. Moses looked upon God, and God informed Moses. He says, as for the rich and powerful horseman, he left his money there under the tree. And that woman, the old poor single mom with her teenager, he raped that woman long time ago. And he left her with no child support. And so all this money is gonna go to help that woman with her child. As for the old raggedy man is responsible for the misery of this rich and powerful horseman, because the old raggedy man has killed that rich and powerful horseman father while this rich and powerful horseman was still he was still not born. So if we look at all these perspectives, divine wisdom, there is a divine wisdom behind everything that happens that we might not understand as human from our human reasoning. We are people who we should never ever give up hope, and we're people that we trust in God Almighty. I want to be more specific as I finish here, that Joseph, the story of Joseph is the only chronological story in the Quran. And, you know, Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, seduced, he was falsely accused, imprisoned, dealt with scarcity in jail. He was a religious minority. He was an ethnic minority. And when he was in jail, he learned about scarcity. He knows what domestic abuse, when he came out of jail, he knew what domestic abuse was. And he knew what trafficking is, and he knew what sexual abuse is, and he knows what prison industry looks like, and he knows what minorities go through. So he served with justice because he could relate to all these issues. Relating on some of the stories that both a rabbi and preacher just spoke about, divine justice, and divine lessons. And basically, what doesn't kill you make you stronger is something we could take. From the Muslim perspective, prosperity is also a test. I want us all to look at our own lives and think about certain things that happened in our life that we thought it was the worst thing that ever happened to our lives. It was the best things. If you look at it from that perspective, it was the best thing that ever happened to us. I survived a massacre in 1982 in Lebanon. I was among a few people who survived the massacre in Lebanon. I've heard Jesus and Mary's name invoked as people actually butchered 1,800 people of my friends. But at the same time, the people who rescued me were the Red Cross. At the same time, the people who fed me when I was an orphan and who took care of me and clothed me were also Christians. Miss Rahma, which is a word translated into Arabic as Mother Mercy, was a nun who took care of me. And that's why in Oklahoma City, every single organization that I've been involved in bear the name of a Christian nun. Mercy. We have Mercy School, Mercy Education Foundation, Mercy Mission Building, Mercy Clinic. All these charities are named after a Christian nun. I was John Doe number 2 in Oklahoma City bombing. If any of you are old enough to remember Oklahoma City bombing, out of this evil and wicked bombing here, the Interfaith Alliance of Oklahoma came about, and a mission of interfaith. People don't think of Oklahoma City as an interfaith city, but because of the evilness and the wickedness of Oklahoma City bombing, we have a very strong interfaith community in Oklahoma City. I'm not going to talk about practical approach because the rabbi spoke about those 5 practical approaches for us, but this is a test for all of us and how we're going to find God. A passage that probably is a Muslim, Christian, and Jewish passage. The Prophet Muhammad tells us that a man was trying to find God, and God told him, if you would have went to the poor and took care of them, you would have found me there. If you would have gave water to the thirsty, you would have found me there. If you would have helped an orphan, you would have found me there. This is a test for all of us to get closer to one another. This is not affecting one person, one race, one gender. This is affecting everyone. Perhaps God tried to tell us there's only one race, the human race. Perhaps God tried to tell us that there's only one people, the human people. And perhaps God is trying to tell us there's only one kind of suffering, and that's human suffering, that we should take care of one another and help one another. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Imam. So we now have a little bit of time left. If anybody would like to ask any questions for any of us or all of us, just post the questions in the chat box. There's a little chat icon in the center bottom of your screen probably. So you can click on that link and then type a question in the message area there. And if you want to address it to one of us, you can say who you want to address it to, or just say you want to address it to everybody. So we'll give you a minute or two to think about that.
We did so good. Nobody wants to ask a question.
Yeah, we answered all the questions.
Answered all the questions.
Everybody knows where God is in this pandemic, right?
So and one of the things that the Imam didn't mention is he just came back from Beirut. You know, there was a large bombing in Lebanon, not an accident apparently. A huge store of ammonium nitrate exploded and caused a huge explosion there. I just saw today on the news there was a wedding apparently going on right near there, and the wedding was ruined, of course, by the bombing. So, but the Imam was there. No, he had just been in Lebanon. He had just come back when the bombing took place. Yeah.
Yeah, I just came back, and my niece actually clinic is downtown, not far away from the blast, and she was missing for about 6 hours. She's a dentist, and the blast, if to give you a perspective, Oklahoma City bombing was only 2 tons. The blast was 3,000 tons. And thank God it was next to the ocean, that the ocean took a lot of that pressure. But 15 miles radius of destruction from the other side was, so she was, her phone blew away, her workstation blew away. And then by the time we found her at the American University of Beirut Hospital, of course, a lot of evil thought came to our mind, but she was fine well with minor injuries. That blast could be heard all the way to Cyprus, all the way to the southern and eastern Lebanon. So.
Wow. So there was one question in the chat box: how can we all come together and not be so politically fighting with each other? That's a good project for us to all work on. I think one of the tragedies is the divisiveness in our country right now, that it really prevents us from cooperating more with each other, and that if we can get past the rhetoric and the talking points and come down to the level of what do we actually believe, what do we feel in our hearts, how do we want to treat our fellow citizens, maybe we could come to some more agreements. But that's a challenge. I think part of it is how we have to learn how to talk to each other. Mm-hmm. We also need to learn how to listen to each other more.
In my book, my conclusion chapter is called "Lend Me an Ear." E for education, A for attitude, and R for relationship. So we need to learn. Actually, we need to learn about one another first and foremost. There's so much misconceptions out there, and I'm glad if you want to learn about Judaism that the rabbi is there. If you want to learn about Christianity, Paul is there. Not the disciple Paul, but this Paul, right? so if you want to learn about Islam, I always tell people, why would you go to KFC to learn about Big Mac? You want to go to McDonald's to learn about Big Mac. So to get the positive education, the real education from the people, that would affect your attitude towards other people. But there's nothing that seals that better than a relationship. Statistically speaking, people, they took a survey, 96% of people would say that they will not feel comfortable having a Muslim as their next door neighbor. And then those very same people, after 4 years, they took another surveys after Muslims moved in the neighborhood, and that people start talking to each other and so on and so forth. The same number went down to 20%. So relationships, I have a wonderful relationship in my Catholic schools with the nuns, and that's why when people came to my refugee camp and massacred people, the only Jesus I could think of is the one who fed me, clothed me, took care of me, and gave me sugar candy. So relationships really makes all the difference in the world. And I don't know how much time we have, but we have haters coming here to our Mercy Mission buildings. Had one hater with gun actually come in to demonstrate about Islam, and he had a big mole on his left cheek. And I actually came to speak with him and engaged him. And I actually asked him if he would want to go into my free clinic to check it out. And it was cancer. And to this day, we still take care of him and help him out absolutely free. And now he's our security guard that he does it free for us. Wow. So repelling hate with love is a formula that is very Abrahamic, and it is something that could be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. What you both said was wonderful. Just briefly, I really like the language of that question. How can we not be so politically fighting with each other? The fighting is the piece that is such a key issue. This is from a Christian perspective, but I'm sure we can all share. I think part of the answer is to not be afraid of people who have a different view than us. We like the world to be black and white. In many ways, we haven't graduated past the Disney World movies from childhood. I should say, some of our childhoods. But Disney does a really good job at portraying villains and good people. There's good people and there's bad people. The problem is, in the real world, it's not that clear. And we pretend that it's clear. So every issue is either or, black and white. And there's no room. If you have a different view than me, then there's no room for that. And I think that part of it, I think that Dr. Enchassi, that was beautiful. Relationship. I mean, from a Christian perspective, and this is for the Christians here and also for the rest of you, that Christian texts point to Jesus, who was a really good model of interacting with people who were very different from him with love and gentleness and respect. Ultimately, we believe he was God, perfectly sinless, and he came and he drew near to sinners. And there's no black and white issue that is more black and white than God's holiness versus human sinfulness. And he was pleased to draw near to us and learn to love us, listen to stories. And so we get to do that with one another, listening, which both of you said is such an important thing, and engaging with one another with love.
So I see there's some other comments here about wanting to do more of these, and we will do more of these over the course of the year. Hopefully we'll have more opportunities to do this. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight and being part of this. And I think you can see that even though we come from slightly different perspectives. We're all Abrahamic, but somewhat different perspectives about things. We agree on much of particularly what we ought to do about it, right? What we ought to do to help each other to get through this time and to improve ourselves and to hopefully make our society stronger. And we can do that working together even when we have disagreements about our beliefs or even some of our ideas about how to make society better. We can still come to some compromises by listening and avoiding kind of ugly rhetoric, I think.
I think we need to get Paul a hat too, since he's not wearing a hat. So he's the only one.
I feel so left out, guys.
Right.
Right. I'll get you a Sooner hat, but you're in Texas, so we'll get you a Sooner.
I can't do that. Can't do that, Dr.
Anyway. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you for participating, and let's keep the faith, and we will get through this for sure, and we'll have more of these programs as well in the future. So
yes,
thank you all.
Bless.
No bless. I would say, Rabbi Morgen, would you be able to send out to the registrants our email addresses? I don't want to volunteer this for the both of you, but.
Sure.
But if anyone wants to reach out with more questions or for more information, I just shared with a couple of people in the private chat.
Sure, we could do that, and also send your handout if you. We could send out your handout.
Yes, and we've got it. We're recording, so we can. For some people who jumped on late, we can send you the recording and the texts and everyone's contact information.
Wonderful.
That'd be great.
I will. Somebody asked privately about my book. It's called Sky Miles. I will put it in the chat.
Yeah, wonderful.
Okay. Okay. Thank you all.
Rabbi Morgen, Dr. Enchassi, Imam Enchassi, what an honor to be with you guys.
Thank you. Thank you. Looking forward for these. Thank you.
Yes, as am I. Jennifer, thanks for all of your logistical front work.
Absolutely. All right. Have a good night, everybody.
All right. Take care.
Take care.
You too.